Well, hello, friends, and welcome to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. My name is Mags, and I will be your host for today's episode. With me is a longtime friend, Ted Esler, who serves now as the president and CEO of Missio Nexus. He's going to walk us through some of the major trends that he sees in global missions today. We've entitled today's episode, Trends and Tensions of Global Missions Today. Ted, welcome back to the Global Missions Podcast.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on, Mike's.
Well, we want to fly up high, be a little bit general and broad-ranging today, and Ted is well positioned to speak to some of the major trends in global missions across the world. Our vantage point is primarily, Ted, from North America, but you've got a broad range view. So we're going to allow lots of space. What's the first trend that you'd like to share with our audience about global missions?
Okay, well, the first one that I would mention is one that is going to feel a little bit abstract, but it is what I call a fading Missio Dei missiology. A
fading Missio Dei missiology. So Missio Dei may or may not be familiar to our listeners. What is meant by Missio Dei?
So Missio Dei is a way of thinking about missions that it really was birthed 1920s, 30s, that era. Karl Barth had a lot to do with its development in the early days. It was a bit of a reaction to human agency in mission and the idea that missions could be pursued scientifically. In other words, we can figure things out in mission. And Missio Dei was an attempt at a more Trinitarian view of mission and an attempt to align mission with the person of God. And so Missio Dei literally means the mission of God. Some writers say that before that we talked in terms of Missio Ecclesia, the mission of the church. And if you think back to the 1930s, you'd remember that there was a lot of angst about the failure of modernity and the philosophical viewpoint that we can essentially engineer or scientifically create a better future for ourselves. It kind of went out the window with the advent of World War I and just the grossness of that war. And missiologists, missions professionals, they basically followed that same path of trying to dump modernity. And so part of their response was to come up with this idea of Missio Dei. How does it practically work itself out? Well, I bet you that some of your listeners know a guy named Henry Blackaby. And he made a phrase that is often quoted and repeated that kind of goes like this: find out where God is working and join him there. And I think Missio Dei was super helpful in the early days to readjust how we were thinking about mission. And even today, it can help us, I think, appropriately think about how we do mission. But Missio Dei has also had some negative consequences.
So generally, a positive thing, it sounds like. It's biblically based that God is working in the world. It's his mission, and we are joining him. I remember the Blackaby you mentioned, he described a wave, at least in one of his books, and are we riding the wave of God's purposes? Generally, would you say Missio Dei is a good thing?
Well, in its day, it was much needed.
Right, which you were just getting to.
But I also think it had some negative fallout. So when we think about Missio Dei being all-encompassing, so everything that God is doing then can be defined as mission. And when everything is mission, nothing is mission. You might have heard that phrase.
Denny and Matthew.
Yeah, Denny and Matthew, that's right. Two authors of a book called When Everything is Missions. And I think what we're seeing in the global mission space right now is people recognizing that idea that when everything is missions, it basically strangled mainline Protestant missions. So, 20 years ago, 30 years ago even, there were Protestant mission agencies. Today, they're almost all gone. And part of that is because Missio Dei abstracted mission so much that people lost sight of the soteriology. In other words, the salvation aspects, the conversionistic aspects of mission. And as the church goes more global, especially as the global south begins to take it up, they're much more excited. I use a little 3-letter acronym, EDP, to stand for evangelism, discipleship, and planting churches. So the E and the D, evangelism and discipleship, are commanded in the scripture. And the planting of churches is the natural outcome if you do 1 and 2. And so EDP tends to provide a little bit of a narrower definition than Missio Dei and focuses people. And I think what you're going to find if you go out there and you walk among many of the global south leaders, they're not so interested in the Western abstraction of mission, which is what Missio Dei is, a Western missiology. They're more interested in EDP. How do we get this job done? How do we move forward? And to be fair, I would also say that there is a Western movement, mostly made up of mission agency activists and mission agency organizations and personnel, that are also more concerned about EDP. But inside of academic missiology, I would say Missio Dei really rules the roost. And I'm not sure that 10, 15 years ago it's going to be as dominant as it is now, because it's kind of led to its own demise.
Now, you said the trend that you're observing is a fading of Missio Dei in our thinking about missions. Is there something emerging to take its place yet? Maybe that's further on in the trends that you have, but is there something taking its place?
I wouldn't say that there really is yet. I would say so a couple things I would say about why I think it's going to fade. One, I think the original impetus has kind of come and gone. Today, people are dealing way more with issues of identity than they are with human agency. And so I don't think Missio Dei is scratching the itch that especially young people have in the world today. And so I'm not sure if what comes next is even going to be like a replacement or a repudiation of Missio Dei. It actually might be something that builds on top, but it'll be more important than the way that these future generations have thought about Missio Dei, I think, to emerging mission movements, particularly those outside of the Western world.
I do like the idea. I mean, it's just a personal opinion, but the idea that God is on his mission, Missio Dei. He is accomplishing his purposes in our world, and we get to join him. I can sign up wholeheartedly for that, but also just that it be too abstract. And I look forward to hearing how you see it getting even more tangible, maybe.
Well, let me give you an example of the tangible kind of catch here. If you really want to be on the cutting edge of mission, you go to a frontier people group. So a frontier people group is not just an unreached people group, but it's a unreached people group in which there's virtually no believers, no churches. This is frontier work, right? God is not evidently working. The only way you can say God is working there is to go abstract and say something like, well, he's called you to think about it, so he must be doing something. And I think as people try to define needs, this is an example of how Missio Dei maybe lacks in terms of providing us with direction.
Oh, very good. So the first trend, then, fading Missio Dei in missiology. We will include these trends in our show notes, by the way. If you're listening and you're riding your bike or driving or whatever, we'll have some show notes available after this discussion with Ted. What's the next trend you want to mention, Ted?
Well, I would say this kind of goes hand in hand with this fading Missio Dei, perhaps, but more conservative, not less conservative. This is a trend, I think, that is really driven by the global south. We are having very different discussions around the world about large philosophical issues. One good way to frame this is around GAFCON. Have you heard of GAFCON, Megs? What a great acronym that is. Huh? That's the Global Anglican Fellowship that has emerged out of Africa with the goal of re-evangelizing the Anglican Church. Because so many Anglicans have kind of gone down a more liberal theological route, the African movement decided, we need to form something new, and then we need to bring that renewal back to those who initially brought us the gospel. And that idea, it's the example I give you is Anglican, but it is happening in a much broader spectrum in the global mission movement. Some of it doesn't feel too good for us Westerners.
Right, right. Well, I've experienced something like this in some of my travels when I've, for example, visited a receiving area, mission field, and observed the work that's going on there, sometimes with expatriate missionaries still there, or maybe a national church that's rising up in God's goodness. And then I come back to Canada and I describe what I've seen there, and Canadians say, "Hey, we need more of that. We need them to come to our world and bring that good stuff from what used to be a mission field that we went to and bring it back here." So
definitely, and this I think is going to play itself out into potential conflicts between Western missionaries and more global South missionaries.
how do you see that impacting agencies that you know well in North America? Many of our listeners will know agencies sending from North America. How is it affecting the agencies or even churches as we share in the mission?
There's numerous theological issues. Women in leadership is an example. If you're a church planter, let's say you're a 45-year-old Arab man planting churches in the Middle East, and you just received in your multinational mission agencies a 23-year-old young woman from Toronto onto your team, there is a world of gender differences and a world of ways thinking in terms of how we think about male-female relationship. And because so much of missions is internationalized, I think these types of tensions are going to come to the fore. And it's going to happen in many different areas. How strict are we going to be about baptism? I mean, you just whatever controversies happened in the church in the last 30 or 40 years, we're going to be relitigating those with our global partners. I just would have to say, too, they're looking at the church in the West, and they're thinking, what is going on in these churches? And again, like I said, it can be hard for us to hear that, but that is the reality today.
Sure. It again, we've spoken about it many times on this program about a new posture for us in the West as God has a global church, and especially as the global South rises and participates in evangelism, discipleship, and church planting, that our place is different. And we're not just coming as the one all-knowing West, coming with our insights. I wonder whether I've seen something that is a bit of a generalization, but I wonder when you see churches on that spectrum of conservative and liberal, whether there are more participating in global missions from the conservative elements or from the liberal elements. I think I know the answer. I've seen some things along this line.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that more conservative churches are more engaged in global mission. Again, when you go across cultural, though, the conservative issues are different. The spectrum, and then what they evaluate as conservative and liberal is different. And so this just calls us to be very culturally astute and culturally aware as we venture forth and try to partner well in the global South.
We don't have time to unpack it all, unfortunately, but some of the elements I think are going to be cultural, as you just said. They're going to be cultural preferences and realities. But I've also heard the conversation pushing back to what is biblical. And that becomes really tricky, and cultural and biblical, and which is this? Is it biblical, or is this a biblical principle, or is it a cultural principle, and how those interact? And not everybody sees that interaction the same either.
Yeah, well, and the other piece of this that's important is church tradition. And as evangelicals, we tend to be light on church tradition, yet I think a lot of even the contemporary controversies in global mission today are around church forms, how we structure church leadership, what we actually call a church. Those are all things that are in flux in this current moment.
Super. Well, there's a couple of big trends. Fading Missio Dei, more conservative, not less. What's the next trend you mentioned, Ted?
Well, this one I sometimes don't share as a trend because in many ways we feel like it's already here. It's not something in our future. But I do think this one is also in our future, and that is just a growing diaspora or immigrant or refugee focused global mission. If you're in a major urban area, this one's like, well, yeah, that's how it's been here for quite a while. But it's really on steroids now. I mean, it's really grown and become much more prominent. Mission agencies that used to think in terms of geography no longer think in terms of geography. They think in terms of culture, much more so. Now, I always like to caveat this one a little bit because we as Westerners are much more exposed to diaspora trends than the rest of the global population. So, for example, let's say you were living in northern India, highly populated place. You are not seeing the kind of ethnic diversity that you see on the streets of, New York or Toronto or LA or, you name it. It's far more homogenous. But Western cities, particularly European, Canadian, the coast of the U.S., highly diverse because of immigrants. And what's happened here with this discussion is it's almost taken what was a lot more of our missions discussion was what was happening in the global south. And this has somewhat repatriated the conversation back to our own shores. Some ways that's good for churches because it's bringing the mission to their doorstep. One of the weaknesses of seeing mission this way is that the vast majority of those that are in unreached people groups are not the ones traveling around the world globally. And I like to ask the question, Megs, I want you to give me a guess here. What percentage of the world's population lives outside of their birth country?
Well, because of your previous articling, Ted, I kind of know the answer to this, and I spring forward from this. But let me just ask our audience, just for a second there, as Ted asks this, just pick a percentage. What percentage of the world's population do you think lives outside their birth country? Pick a number. And we'll ask Ted to inform that. I do the same question now, Ted, because of you. So what percentage?
I get answers anywhere from 50, 55%. Rarely do I get an answer down in the right area. It's about 3.2, 3.3%. It's a small number. So if we're going to actually reach the world, we cannot think just in terms of diaspora, but we can't be dismissive either.
Yes, yeah, that's it. And I appreciate that's the way Ted has always postured it, and I seek to do the same. It's it's just informing the reality that we have lots of neighbors coming to our shores. Kath, my wife, this morning was involved with conversation circles at our little church plant, inviting women from other countries who are new Canadian women to be in conversation groups so they can improve their English. Should we do diaspora ministries where we're placed? Absolutely. Please do diaspora ministries and be salt and light to new neighbors. And it's a relatively small percentage of unreached peoples who have the opportunity and capacity to travel to our shores. The vast majority of unreached people are still unreached, and they are in their homelands. Well, that was okay. This is supposed to be asking you, Ted, what you think, but that's what
Yeah, but you preach it, brother. That's right on. I mean, one of the dynamics of immigration is that a population that has a fair number of immigrants, like so I used to live in your city of London. What'll happen there is you'll have a large number of a small set of cultures. Now, many of us hear this number of, how many different people groups live in Toronto or how many different people groups live in New York City. But if you analyze those numbers, what you're going to find is 3 or 4 dominant groups make up the vast majority of the actual numbers of people that are not native born. And because of the way the globe works, that just strands thousands of people groups that have no gospel witnesses living among them without the message.
We're saying both and, right?
Both and. It's got to be both and. That's right.
Yes. Be salt and light right across the street, but still send to the ends of the earth.
And the other thing about that is we have not seen a great return home influence. So that is a problem that numerous mission teams that I'm aware of are really working hard on solving. And there are some success stories now. So that to me is a little bit of a bright light in the bigger picture too.
Yeah, I think it's a Western thing. It's maybe strategic to think, this person has come from their homeland to Canada, and if they come to know the Lord, then they'll want to go back to where they came from. And that there may be a gap in our understanding there. And there are some ministries that we're increasingly seeing grow up where some of the digital connections are being created, digital bridges that are near culture that way, but not necessarily physical presence going home, if you will. So there are all kinds of great models that are emerging there. So migration and immigration, basically, your third trend was the movement of people in our world. What's another trend, Ted, that you mentioned?
Oh, another trend is, you're going to hear this word more and more in your future if you're involved in missions. This word is mutuality.
Okay, I think I know what that means, but what do you mean by it?
So it refers to the empathetic, cross-cultural kind of ministry that sees the person really in the imago Dei that God intended, and not so much as the object of our ministry plans and strategies. We enter into a mutual relationship with them as opposed to seeing them from a position of historic power, which is how missions has operated for the most part for a long time. Mutuality, it flavors, virtually all areas of mission, from personal relationships we might have to how we structure programs, you might have heard of the community health and education movement, CHE, that talks about how, when we go in to do some type of assistance somewhere, we actually look for the resources in the community as opposed to import them or bring them from the outside. That's an example of mutuality working itself out. Early empowerment of Indigenous people in terms of how we do and construct ministry. All of these things are really helpful adjustments to how we do mission. But you're going to be hearing that word mutuality much more in your future than we've heard it in the past. And I really think it's a great one.
I was just going to say, I see that as a positive development. It's a posture of humility. There's some things in our language that we've used historically. One that really gets me is target people group. I cringe, as opposed to going and being there with them and much more, use the word empathetic, sharing together. And it does tie back to what you said a little bit before about Missio Dei. I think that God is at work and preparing some pieces, and we go into places and watch for how we can share in that with the people there. Mutuality seems like a real positive trend. It's good for us from the West, hey? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is. Now, like anything, it too can be abused. One of the premises of Christian missionary work is, if you're the missionary, you know Jesus and they don't know Jesus. So there's a difference between you and them right off the bat. If you think they're one and the same, if you think that there's no difference between you and them, which, mutuality would seem to lend itself to, then you're going to erase or erode this difference. And unfortunately, I think there are some contemporary books that are promoting mutuality that go that far, and they almost teach or preach a universalism as they're pursuing this concept of mutuality. So like anything, it can also be abused. And so I think it's a super positive part of our future, but I also think that we're going to see some excesses.
Well, I'm going to mention this just to my Canadian friends. I'm a Canadian, and Ted has lived in Canada. His family lived in Canada for a season. That we, in our culture here, strive to hold a high value of tolerance and welcoming, which I think can be good. And it also, as you just mentioned, Ted, can be in tension with the idea that Jesus said, "I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me." So there's this exclusive tone to our message, combined with this mutual, maybe, or tolerant. Well, what you believe is fine for you. I'm sure that'll be good. Those need to be held in this wise biblical tension. And I think Canadians, to my dear Canadian friends, let's be courageous and clear on the good news of the gospel. It is exclusive. It will be countercultural for us. And hopefully we can be wise and gracious all along those conversations. So mutuality, Ted, great one. Hopefully we can bear it wisely. You got a couple more for us.
Yeah, the next one has to do with declining population in many, many countries of the world. Very advanced in places like Korea, Eastern Europe. Very significant implications for global mission. I think we're going to see a shift in how we think about doing ministry. I work with lots of different organizations in my role at Missio Nexus. Many times I've heard people talk about the importance of working with young people. I don't know if I can remember a time when someone said, we're going to be really great at loving old people into the kingdom. Yet, if you look at the population pyramid right now, instead of having all the young people on the bottom getting older, it's inverting, and we're going to have way more older people in our ministries than younger people.
Yep, the triangle's flipped. Mm-hmm.
That's going to be a stressor for how we do mission and how church operates. Another follow-up from this is what happens in like I was a missionary in Eastern Europe. You could drive back when I was living there, you could go to small villages and they would be vibrant little villages. Today, those are emptied out. All the young people decided it was better off going to Western Europe to work. And the old babas, the grandmas and whatnot have aged out and nobody's moved back into those places and they're essentially abandoned. We're going to see that on a global basis. And so that'll also be it'll be an urbanizing effect that comes about as a result of declining populations. Interestingly, so we're talking about Canada. Canada has a tradition and a history of accepting immigrants. Population decline will probably accelerate that because of what I just talked about. When you don't have a growing population, it's almost impossible to have a growing economy. It's never really happened over a sustained period in the history of humanity. It can happen for short amounts of time, but when people don't see prospects, they tend to leave.
This is a complexity for Canada for sure, and that's not the main focus of our conversation, of course, but our previous Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, had really emphasized immigration as something we need to do, and it has been rolled back a little bit because the infrastructure couldn't keep up. And so all these ideas about migration that you've mentioned, and the ability of countries to receive and population change economically, it's a broad economic adjustment that needs to be considered. It is really, it's really complex. It sometimes feels that we as believers then in a standard local church, we're caught along in some of this tide. We can't really maybe directly affect it too much, but by being aware of it, we can be wise, right?
I think so. And I think, there's a lot of politics around immigration, obviously. The thing I like to remind people of is when there's a person in front of you, that's the one God's calling you to minister to. And as much as you possibly can to just divorce the politics from that person in front of you. I don't think this immigration issue is going to go away. I don't think the limitations, I'm in the U.S. right now, and the rhetoric and the pushback, I think it's temporary. I don't think it's temporary because of, Republicans or Democrats or liberals and conservatives. It's temporary because our cultures, the majority cultures, are having a very few babies, and we're going to want those people in our cultures. Anyway, it's a challenge for us in the church to think well about how to love these people.
Now, you've got one more trend to share with us, I know, Ted, but you mentioned Missio Nexus in that answer. I wonder if you just describe for our audience quickly, Missio Nexus. I might have heard of that, or maybe it's the first time they've heard of it. What is Missio Nexus that you are leading?
Missio Nexus is the association of missionary agencies and globally focused churches in the U.S. and Canada. We have about 340 or so mission agency members, over 100 some churches that are also members. And what we do is we catalyze relationships, ideas, and collaboration within the Great Commission community. And if you were to attend a Missio Nexus event, you would have the opportunity to rub shoulders with people that are church planning, doing discipleship and evangelism, or more often even leading those efforts. We really have a high focus on the leaders of these organizations and ministries. It's a very fun thing to be involved in, represents 50 to 60,000 missionaries globally dispersed, and just lots of super things happening.
Well, I just want to commend this organization to you. It's missionexus.org. If you or your church think, boy, I'd like to find more people, another place to connect with those who really want to do a great job of global missions, this is one of the possibilities. And there are loads of resources, and you can learn more on the website there. Ted, appreciate your leadership of that organization. So we have these trends. I won't go over the 5. I'll review the 6 in a minute. You've got a sixth and final trend for us.
And by the way, we're leaving out AI in this.
Oh, yes. Okay, that would be the bonus trend.
AI would have to be its own podcast call. But the last one I would mention is just the end of globalization. And it's interesting, Mags. I did my first presentation on the end of globalization in 2022. I mean, I used to have to explain what I meant by the end of globalization. I don't have to do that anymore. You know, when you have, for example, the U.S. president in the last week or two saying they're going to pull all the Americans out of NATO, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That the global order that kind of has been running the world since probably the early 50s is in mass change, in mass upheaval. And as a result, global missions is going to be affected. The freedoms that we as Westerners have enjoyed to travel globally, you know, we talk about the power of a passport, for example, to get you into many countries. Well, that chart is shifting almost every day as different countries and different wars, different conflicts, different agreements are signed. All of these things are creating some relationships that is upsetting that global order. I think what we're going to see is a future in which there are regional blocks that are much more important than global blocks. And it has implications for all sorts of areas of mission. The last, especially since about 1974, we've had a huge emphasis on the global church. My sense is that in missions, we're going to talk more in the future. We'll still talk about the global church, but we'll talk about the African church. Now, when you say the African church, you're actually talking about a large group of very diverse cultures put into one bucket just because of geography. But that kind of regionalization, I think, is going to grow, not shrink in the future because of the end of this globalized world that we've lived in.
Let me ask, just to go one layer deeper on this then, for someone who's in a local church here in North America, and all these things are a reality that we understand. We have many friends of this podcast who are in the United States, many are in Canada, and even some of that has changed. But sitting in a local church, how should we consider adjusting? Should we change anything? What should we do about this?
Well, there's so many thoughts that roll in. For example, we might say that Trump is forcing these changes. I would actually say that he just happened to be the guy that came along. He is definitely, moving it down the road. But these kind of global forces are much larger than any one country or any one politician or person. And understanding the kinds of stressors that this is going to put on different cultures. Let's just take this trend and the previous one about population implosion and think about it through the eyes of a Chinese pastor. The Chinese, it's a large bunch of people, right? Well, their population is going to probably shrink to about half of what it is today. As a Christian, you're being persecuted by your own government in that context. And globalization is actually what made your boat float in China over the last 20 to 30 years. And now that system is being pulled apart and destroyed. And so you're looking toward a future with less prosperity, not more. And now we'll shift. Now you're a pastor in Calgary and you want to have a partnership with a Chinese fellowship, in Xinjiang, let's say. Understanding and empathizing with the plight that they're in, without that becoming political or in some way caught up, in the power structures, it can really change your ideas about what that pastor is going through and how you can best serve or partner with that Chinese pastor. Or you could go to a village in the rural part of Africa where all the young people are fleeing and they're going to the big city for education because there's nothing here in the village. And you're partnering with a small church plant that's in that village. Hopefully you can empathize a little bit with the fact that it's very difficult for them to see that new generation of future leaders get up and go. So I would just say understanding that I was in Korea last year went to a big mega church there. I mean, it would be a mega church by, standards in the U.S., and over there they're even bigger, right? The pastor prayed for population growth from the pulpit as the very first prayer he prayed over the congregation, because they're down. Their population, it's in mass decline.
I've got to say, I've never heard that prayer request at our church.
I don't know. You'd never hear that in a Western church. No, it wouldn't happen. But look at later that same week, I was in a seminary. The seminary used to have hundreds and hundreds of students. Now they were down to like half a dozen students. They're sitting in a huge campus complex with no students. And that has changed in the span of about 6 or 7 years. How do you partner with them as a Canadian mission or as a local church that wants to have a relationship to a Korean church? Those are all the kinds of implications that the end of globalization is going to make us face. And here's another funny thing about this. If you read all these books on the end of globalization, guess what two countries always seem to come out ahead of everybody else? The U.S. and Canada. The rich get richer. It feels a little unjust, actually, but because we have immigrant cultures, we're used to absorbing immigrants, we're going to be the destination for a lot of the wealthy money that's going to leave these places and come to our shores. So one implication to this situation in the world today is to remember that the people sitting in our churches are wealthy beyond the imagination of many of the people that are part of the kingdom that live globally, or the people that are in unreached people groups that don't have the gospel. And we could be much more serious about using our wealth to bless them by seeing more evangelism, discipleship, and planting of churches in their midst.
It's being good stewards. I know that term gets bandied about, but in the big picture that you hear coming from Ted today, what does it look like to be generous stewards of all that God has entrusted to us in the West? And whether we feel particularly rich compared to the folks in our immediate context, in the global context, what Ted is saying is very, very true. Ted, I wonder, each of these, you could write a book on each of these, and then there's AI, like you said, another trend. We could talk about how it's affecting everything. I'd like to just spend a couple of minutes synthesizing this for our faithful folks in local churches across Canada and the United States and other places where they may be listening. How do we bring these together? What's the snapshot when you bring it together? What do you want to say to that group of people?
So I was thinking about this the other day, Megs. I was with a gentleman who just retired. He's like, 68. He turned 68. He just retired. We were talking about AI. And he said, and he worked in the software industry his whole life. He said to me, man, I'm so glad I'm getting out of this industry as AI comes in, because I just can't take another huge wave of change. And I think that is kind of how we feel at times with all of the constant shifting and shaking. We're in an era of world history where things are changing at an extremely rapid pace. And I think just the reminder that none of this has taken God by surprise. He's in the midst of these changes. The anxiety that's coming out of it are open doors for us to lovingly put our arms around others and just say, you know what, it is going to be all right, because we know where it's headed. God does love you. I would just say that these changes are creating incredible open doors. We live in the time of greatest kingdom expansion. I would almost say, even if you go back to the first, second century church, it was expanding pretty fast, right? It still took 300 or 400 years for it to really get scale and scope. Whereas what's going on, I think, especially in the Muslim world right now, we've never seen a turning to Jesus like we're seeing right now. So I would just say, in the midst of all of what's going on, we just got to keep our eyes on Jesus. And I know that sounds trite, but it's really true. Things are moving at a pace that God can easily keep up with.
That is such an encouragement, and so important that we keep in front of us, because as you've observed, even in this conversation, there is decline in some of our institutional efforts, in our seminaries, even in our churches. And so if we're in this environment where there is decline, you're countering that with this global vision or view that you have, that to remind us that that's not true everywhere. And the wind of the Spirit is blowing very brightly, very powerfully in some places. So I hope that's an encouragement to you who are listening, that whatever we see and the changes and sometimes decline that we're wrestling with, it's not necessarily true everywhere in the world. Ted, what were you going to add? I heard you take a breath.
Yeah, I was just going to say, a term that I like is optimistic and pessimistic at the same time. Optimistic. There are areas that would maybe make us feel a little bit cynical on this big, huge blue marble. But, in the last couple of days, so when we're filming this, Artemis is up there in the sky right now. And I have absolutely loved hearing the perspective that those astronauts are having as they're looking back down at this big blue marble. And I mean, basically they're preaching it, and they're recognizing the expansiveness of what God is doing and has done. And so I hope that gives us some hope. That's a really great perspective check for us.
Sure is. Ted, I wonder, just as we wind down, we want to do global missions well from our local churches. Many of our listeners are on missions committees, or they may serve in some kind of leadership role in their local church. Is there anything that you would add, just in summary or highlight, as we think about doing global missions from a local church in light of these trends?
Yeah, I guess a couple of points. First one I would just say is, many of the things that we've been focusing on in global missions for the past few decades are still very relevant. The Unreached People Group Challenge is as relevant as it ever has been. There's been some progress made, but it hasn't removed the need for us to continue to press in on the fact that there are many cultures where there's just so few believers and so few churches that they need outside assistance. So, and that's not the only kind of basic or fundamental need in missions that's still out there, but that still is a big priority. I would say another thing is I always love encouraging churches as they think about their missions contribution. There's a lot of ways you can participate, but churches should remember that churches are the core of mission. And so organizations that are involved in church planting should get the lion's share of your interest when you think about how you want to invest people or dollars or prayers. Because if the church isn't for the church, we're in a lot of trouble. And so if you're in a local church and thinking about missions, I would encourage you, put the church at the top of your list as you think about how you want to invest your people and your resources. Then the final thing I would just say, we mentioned the opportunity to minister globally. There's very few better ways to engage your congregation in the global Great Commission than by also having them involved in the local Great Commission. And they're synergistic with each other. And so lean into that as much as you can and love on those foreigners among you.
Across the street and around the world.
Yep, that is not a decision you need to make. That's a both and.
I want to ask you finally about resources, and just because you mentioned unreached peoples, I was at joshuaproject.net yesterday doing a little bit of research. If you or your church would benefit from understanding the status, and we do this gently, but what is the status of gospel access in a particular people group? The Joshua Project research can be very helpful along that line, joshuaproject.net, and they help describe, is this a reached people group, partly reached? Is that group living in diaspora, maybe down the street from you? A great resource. Ted, do you have any other resources that you would recommend? Substack, go there.
Okay, well, I do publish a weekly Substack. It's not every single week, but it's most weeks. It's at tedesler.substack.com. And I do talk about these missiological issues. I also do a little bit on AI and transformative digital ministry there. I got to tell you one thing about joshuaproject.net that I just did myself, Mags. I was thinking about how can I best pray for Iran right now? And I jumped on there and I searched, and I found out there's 58 unreached people groups in Iran. And I thought, well, that's super interesting. I sent a couple of emails out to my network of people I know that work in Iran. And if there's a church out there thinking, how could we get more deeply involved? A challenge might be to think about how we are going to, as Westerners, get behind the Iranian church as they try to love those 58 people groups and introduce them to Jesus. So there's a lot of great fodder for prayer lists on that Joshua Project website, and I would encourage people to go there and just look up Iran and start looking at the needs that are there. And we've got a small but willing partner in the majority Iranian culture there, because there is a church that wants to reach them.
Ted, I want to say thank you. Thanks for a couple of resources there that you've reminded us of. And I just want to say thank you for your faithful service as you help direct Missio Nexus. And if you're listening to this podcast, you can hear that Ted has a vantage point that allows him to look out over the world and to synthesize some of these big trends for us. Ted, we pray for the Lord's favor for Missio Nexus, for wisdom in leading through seasons of change, and looking forward with a biblical, God-honoring view. Thanks for your service, and thanks for being on the Global Missions Podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Megs. It's always great talking with you.
Well, thanks for joining us for today's conversation. We hope it was an encouragement to hear Ted's high-level view of some of the things that are true in our world today. I did overlook mentioning during our recording that Ted co-hosts an excellent podcast on missions. It's called The Mission Matters, and he co-hosts with Matthew Ellison. The Mission Matters. You do need to include the word "the" in front, because Mission Matters is a different podcast. It might be a great podcast, but it's about business. Make sure you find Ted and Matthew. Their most recent episode, just to give you an idea, is "Are Western Missionaries Still Necessary?" So it gives you an idea of some of the issues that they are wrestling with on that program. We want to invite you to stop by the website of the Global Missions Toolbox, which produces this podcast. There you will find an online library of resources especially curated for folks who want to do a great job of global missions from their local church and sending out workers to share the good news about Jesus. We invite you to check that out. And if you've got any comments or questions, you can reach out to our team, info@globalmissionstoolbox.com. Thanks for joining us. We invite you to be here again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.